Um, was the Republican Party destined to be a fucking dumpster fire, or did Donald Trump fucking pervert the party of Lincoln? And this is a question that everybody's been wrestling with since 2016. Um, Now, a person named Terry Dressbeck, who's a prominent television and film costume designer, had asked a question: how someone, how could someone be a conservative? She didn't mean it as an insult, but she admires Never Trumper conservatives for for their principled stand. But she sincerely wonders why we didn't see this fucking coming. After all, she pointed out, the GOP was the party of the Southern strategy. Pat Buchanan and Newt Gingrich. Wasn't Donald Trump's nomination just an inevitable conclusion to all of this? Basically, some people agree to disagree. Um, as Matt Lewis's political hero Ronald Reagan had said, we do not I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. Indeed, it's easy to imagine certain scenarios where conservatism might have gone in a different direction. What if Colin Powell had won the presidency in '96? What if Mitt Romney had defeated Barack Obama back in 2012? What if 80,000 votes in three states had swung toward Hillary Clinton in 2016? Things didn't have to turn out the way they did. Now Terry Dressbeck had studied conservatism her whole life, and she only saw the inevitable emergence of Trump. And basically I observed it from the inside and saw only the sunny side before becoming disenchanted by the rise of Trump. How is it that so much of what we both thought about the right was wrong? A new book by American Enterprise Institute senior fellow Matthew Continetti titled "The Right: The Hundred Year War for American Conservatism" helps shed light on this question. A recent discussion uh, um, During a recent discussion on Matt Lewis's podcast, Continetti explained that most histories of the American right begin with opposition to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. But Continetti starts earlier, providing some much needed context. If you look at the Republican Party from the 1920s and the Republican Party that we're seeing today, they're both kind of the same. Um, when you think about the Republican Party's reluctant attitude toward foreign intervention, opposition to immigration, and protectionism, you might see many parallels between the GOP of the 1920s and the GOP that we're looking at now. And this is to say that Trump didn't completely transform the Republican Party. In some ways, he merely reverted it back to its former shell. World War II and the ensuing Cold War forced the Republican Party to change. Isolationism and protectionism had been discredited, and a strong national defense and strong international alliances were obvious moves. The Soviet Union served as the glue that held the conservative movement together. Now, if you look at winning this existential battle against an atheistic, imperialist, and Marxist regime, made the various wings of the conservative movement willing to overlook many differences, put their pet issues on the back burner, and police their own ranks. A common culture, a mainstream media monopoly, and post-war consensus helped create guardrails that ensured the game of American politics was mostly played between the 40-yard lines, and inspiring conservative leaders like Reagan emerged to defeat this existential enemy. Um, but once the threat and the leaders were no longer around, we had the incentives that animated its free Cold War state, and it returned to tempt the GOP. Now, for those of us who grew up in the '80s and people that grew up in the '40s, and never mind the 1920s, because some people in the 1920s are not even alive anymore, it seems like ancient fucking history. But it turns out the Reagan era was the anomaly, not the norm. I found out that the Cold War conservatism, which shaped you and shaped everybody in the early life, was unusual in some respects. Continetti had said, but we can see how, in the conservatism in which you and I came of age, those elements that were more conspiratorial and that were fringier and that were most contemptuous of modern America had been cabined off, and that's no longer the case. Now, for understanding how history works is helpful, but Terry wasn't around in the pre-World War II era. She was forming her own opinions about the GOP around the same time that that Matt Lewis was. It's impossible to know what accounts for the discrepancy, but Continetti provides some insight into how the individuals and themes that animated Terry's negative vision for the GOP, and basically the much more rosy one, were always present and always in conflict. Continetti also describes how her vision um, began to slowly gain ground immediately following the Cold War. Now, when it came to Ronald Reagan's presidency and it was coming to an end, conservatives who didn't trust George H.W. Bush as the successor to Reagan's conservative presidency went looking for someone to go into the arena and claim the mantle. Two of the top contenders were the former Nixon speechwriter turned paleo-conservative pundit Pat Buchanan, opted not to run that year, um, and Representative Jack Kemp ran but was floundered. They exemplified two tendencies within the American right, Continetti said. But Kemp's but Jack Kemp's conservatism was inclusive and optimistic. Conversely, Pat Buchanan had already seen that the American right would return to its pre-Cold War, pre-World War II ways, and he determined that he was going to be the leader of that. Continetti observed, but Kemp's 1988 presidential campaign went nowhere, and finally, back in 1996, Kemp was chosen as the running mate in Bob Dole's presidential race, and he got drubbed again. 16 years later, Kemp's heir, Representative Paul Ryan, suffered a similar fate as Mitt Romney's running mate in 2012. And for whatever reason, leaders of this optimistic branch of conservatism were both denied the electoral success that might have changed the nature of the American right. And putting a fine point on it, Continetti summarized, Paul Ryan is the Jack Kemp tradition, and Trump is the Buchanan tradition. Now, of course, this is a fucking complex story, and we could probably throw in, what if George W. Bush hadn't invaded Iraq? As yet another unknowable scenario that would have changed the course of history. That decision discredited compassionate conservatism, neoconservatism, interventionism, and the Republican establishment itself. Now, laying the groundwork for the rise of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, the fact is there has always been a struggle within conservatism between the dark side and the lighter side. Neither tendency has ever been completely vanquished, but for my entire life and until around 2016, the light side was in control. And the history of the right suggests the GOP wasn't destined to go wrong, but it was always going to be a temptation. So if you liked the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find on the About section of YouTube. And just for a few bucks a month, you can help support the channel, and it can go a long way. And thanks for listening.